I don't think that there's been a separatist party that has gotten such a high level of popular support. Normally it's a few hundred votes or a couple percentage point. It was 17% in one of the most recent by-elections. I take that seriously, and I hope that the federal government takes that. We are well aware that there is a large and growing number of Albertans that have lost hope in Alberta having a free and prosperous future as a part of Canada. Many of these Albertans are organizing petitions to trigger a citizen-initiated referendum, as I mentioned earlier.
So I live in Winnipeg in Canada, and recently I was quite taken aback when I started seeing headlines and social media chatter about Alberta possibly separating itself from Canada. So at first it felt like political noise, but then I thought, how serious is it? So could Alberta actually leave Canada? And what would it actually look like? So I decided to dig deep to know what exactly it would need for Alberta to separate or exit from Canada in a legal manner. How would it affect the economy, people, and even the Canadian energy sector? So let's explore what happens if Alberta leaves Canada. So under the Canada's constitution and also per the international law, a province cannot unilaterally secede. That means it cannot separate itself from a nation. A province cannot separate itself from a nation unilaterally by itself. So what does that mean? So that means Alberta can't just decide to leave, hold a vote and declare its independence the next day. So if you see, in 1998, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that there is no legal right under the Constitution or international law for any province to unilaterally separate. However, and this is important, the court also said that if a province like Alberta were to hold a clear referendum where a clear majority voted for secession, then the federal government would be obligated to negotiate. So fundamentally, a federal government can be obligated to come at a negotiation desk, again not legally, using a referendum with clear question and a clear majority. So in practice, this would mean that the Albertans would need to vote in a province-wide referendum, likely with a very clear question of something like, do you want Alberta to become an independent country separate from Canada? So this kind of clear question should be there in the referendum, which should be voted by the Albertans. But even if a clear majority voted for a yes, then also it won't be the end of the story. So even if a clear majority happens, then Ottawa, that means the Parliament, the Prime Minister and the Supreme Court, would get into negotiation of the terms of the agreement of the separation with Alberta. So these negotiations would cover everything from debts to borders, resources, military assets, indigenous land claims, and so on. And here's the key, those negotiations might fail. There's no guarantee of a deal, like we saw for Quebec in 1998. Also, any constitutional changes, including separation, would likely require agreement of at least 7 provinces, representing at least 50% of the population, under what's called the 750 rule. So Alberta can start the process, but the road is pretty long, uncertain, and politically very explosive. It's more like a messy divorce with dozens of lawyers than a simple exit. So Alberta's economy is large, resource-rich, but not heavily diversified. Oil and gas are the major contributors in the Alberta's economy. Alberta's economy is also one of the key drivers in the Canadian economy, which is again heavily dependent on natural resources. In 2023, for example, roughly 84% of the nation's crude oil in Canada and 61% of its natural gas were produced by Alberta. So you see, Alberta has a very huge contribution for crude oil and natural gas to Canada. Hence, you might say that this independence could give Alberta more fiscal control over its own oil royalties and the tax revenues, and end any perceived drainage of revenues to Ottawa. So this of course means more fiscal autonomy for Alberta, right? But let me tell you, this is more theoretical and less factual. So these smaller gains for Alberta might come with bigger costs. So first thing first, if something like this happens, Alberta would lose free access to the Canadian single market. Trade with the rest of Canada could face tariffs, border checks, at least initially. For example, oil and natural gas currently flow through pipelines that cross other provinces in Canada. After separation, what happens? Those routes would have to be renegotiated and even could be blocked or taxed. So Alberta in this case would need to redesign and re-implement many of the federal services. For example, the province would need its own pension plan to replace the Canada pension plan contributions. The Alberta province would need to create its own border security, RCMP or the police forces, and potentially a provincial healthcare fund in place of the Canada Health Transfer payments. So don't you think that these extra expenses would offset the benefits of a separate independent Alberta? Business leaders in Calgary and Edmonton have already said talk of secession is scaring away investments. I mean, if you ask me, it would take some time for Alberta to stand on its own and re-establish itself in the world economy. Like for example, you take other separations or exits like the Brexit. The UK is still recovering from the separation. So these examples are not good models for Alberta to follow. Now let's talk about where Canada would stand with such a secession or separation. So first of all, with such a separation, Canada would lose one of its largest revenues producing province, that is Alberta. Alberta is called a cash cow by many economists for a reason. In fact, Alberta contributes to Canada far more than it ever gets back. For instance, in 2022, Alberta paid about $14.2 billion more to the federal government from taxes and pensions than it received in federal spending, including healthcare, infrastructure, and transfers. Add to it, according to a 2024 Fraser Institute report from 2007 to 2022, Alberta's net contribution to federal finances totaled around $244.6 billion, over 5 times more than British Columbia or Ontario. So, to put that in perspective, the report suggests that without Alberta's extra money, Ottawa would have needed to raise GST from 5% to 7.2% in 2022 just to balance the books. If you know about equalization payments, Alberta has received zero equalization payments since 1965. Hence, overall, you can see that if Alberta succeeds, then Canada would lose billions in tax revenues and other revenues that it gets from Alberta, and still it has to fund the federal programs in other provinces. So you can say that this would create a large fiscal gap, which would require higher taxes and spending cuts in other provinces. Canada would also be cut off from a major part of its energy supply. Alberta is currently the engine of Canada's energy exports. Investors could become nervous. See, global markets do not favor sudden breaks, so Canada's credit ratings and currency might weaken on fears of political instability. Politically, an Alberta exit would ignite debates in other provinces also. Provinces like Quebec or even provinces like the British Columbia might re-evaluate their place in the Confederation of Canada, causing further uncertainties. Hence, overall, we can see that at least for the short term, both Canada and Alberta would suffer from a secession or separation. But over time, both of them, Alberta and Canada, might be able to mend the holes and chart out new partnerships, policies, and trade routes. So, for instance, as we talked about, Alberta would retain all revenue streams currently flowing to Canada, other provinces in Canada, such as the personal income taxes, the corporate income taxes, GST, and CPP contributions. However, after a secession, it would also be solely responsible for funding these federal programs previously handled by Ottawa, including healthcare, education, employment insurance, and major infrastructure projects. Ultimately, the deciding factor will be how effectively Alberta manages this financial trade off, whether it can ensure that the inflow of revenues outweighs the outflow of expenditures. So, what do you think? Let me know in the comments. So let's now zoom and ask, has this been ever tried before? Well, Canada doesn't have to look far. You might know that Quebec held two referendums on independence, one in 1980 and another much closer in 1995. In 1980, about 60% voted no, keeping Quebec within Canada. In 1995, the result came down to a razor thin margin. Just 50.58% opposed separation, while 49.42% voted for it. It was a national nail biter. In the aftermath, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in 1998 that no province can unilaterally secede under the Canadian or the international law. Any attempts to do so must be negotiated with the federal government and the other provinces. To formalize that process, Parliament passed the Clarity Act in 2000. It stated that for any referendums to trigger serious negotiations, the question must be clear, and so must be the majority. And since then, Quebec has shifted its gears. So while the desire for independence hasn't disappeared, focus has shifted towards negotiating more autonomy and recognition of its distinct culture and language within the framework of Canada. And surprisingly, this approach has worked for Quebec. Quebec now enjoys unique powers over immigration, language laws, and even taxation. So it may not be a separate country, but it's far more self-governing than most other provinces in Canada. Now let's look across the Atlantic and talk about the Brexit. Brexit, in which the UK decided to leave the European Union. So in 2016, the UK voted to leave the European Union, but instead of a clean break, it entered into years of messy negotiations on trade, immigration, the Northern Ireland border, legal frameworks, and more. Add to it, there was a massive cost attached to this exit, which the UK is paying now also. In October 2021, the UK's Office of Budget Responsibility calculated that Brexit would shrink the UK's GDP by 4% every year over the long term. To put that in perspective, UK would be losing something around 32 billion pounds annually, money that could have gone into schools, colleges, tax cuts in the UK. And compare this with the EU membership fees that the UK was paying in 2018. That was around 13.2 billion pounds after rebates. So essentially, the UK left the EU to save 13.2 billion pounds and ended up paying more than double in the long-term losses. And here's the kicker. The UK is a sovereign country with a long-standing global presence. Alberta, by contrast, is a province with no formal diplomatic, military or currency infrastructure in place. That means even less average and even more complex, riskier exit. So what do these stories tell us? Whether it's Quebec attempt for secession or the Brexit, one thing is clear: separation is long, complicated, and expensive, which is why many experts and even Alberta's own leaders are leaning towards a more pragmatic path. Instead of pushing for a hard break, Alberta could pursue for greater autonomy, just like Quebec did. Even Premier Danielle Smith has expressed cautious optimism after her conversation with our Prime Minister Mark Carney. She believes Alberta can achieve fairer treatment within Canada without blowing up the system, because sometimes building a better deal inside the house is wiser than burning it down. What do you think? Should Alberta stay or go its own way? Let us know in the comments. Thank you.